We just want to welcome everyone joining us today for our conversation. Today is our second in a series of a topic that we are calling Back to School, Theology 101. Just as students are returning to the classroom this fall, we wanted to provide an opportunity for pastoral leaders to return to learning as well as we are sorting through some of the theological concerns of this season. Early in the pandemic, whether we were able to put a name on it or not, each of us were really in the thick of experiencing grief. There was a loss in our normal routines, a loss of major celebration, of rites of passage or planned experiences, and even the loss of life. Grief is a part of our human experience, but typically the whole world is not grieving at the same time. Our guest today acknowledges this grief and the soul-shaping aspects of this season by pointing us to the worship book of the ancients, the Psalms. In our time today, we're going to hear from someone who is pointing us to the healing and the painful words of Scripture that point us to a faithful witness of God in these turbulent times.
We have invited Dr. Kris Kvam to share with us today. Dr. Kvam is professor of theology at St. Paul School of Theology in Greater Kansas City and Oklahoma City. She also teaches courses in the fields of engaging world religions and women's society and church studies. Born and raised in Litchfield, Minnesota, amid the tenacity of the Nordic Lutheran piety, Kris holds degrees from Emory University, Yale University, and St. Olaf College. Scriptural interpretation, Christian doctrine, and Luther studies form primary concerns of her scholarship. A lay member of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, Dr. Kvam has extensive experience as an ecumenical theologian and has served the church through several global ecumenical bodies. We are so grateful for her presence here today. Dr. Kvam, we look forward to what you will share with us. As a means of just getting started, could you share with us maybe just one thing that hasn't shown up in this brief bio to help us get to know a moment about you before we begin?
Ooh, that's a great invitation. Thank you, Shelley. One thing I didn't say in that bio is how much I love to garden and love to get my hands dirty. It's a great counterpart to, you see all the paper behind me. I love paper too, but dirt is a second love. So that's one thing I would share. Shelley and I would talk about this particular invitation. We came up with this title, Gnashing Teeth and Nurturing Souls, in relation to the Psalms. So I want to start there. And then just to let you know how I'm seeing our hour together, I want to talk a little bit about the Psalms and us. That'll be kind of Bible 101 for some of you, kind of refresher course. Gnashing Teeth will be part 2, and then part 3, Nurturing Souls. And then we'll have these conversations and questions and answers at the seams of each. So if you could hold some of your questions or comments till the end, that would be great. I wanted to say that I saw many familiar faces, and some of you have studied the Psalms with me. So some of this will be familiar, and some of it is probably even shaped by your contributions. I appreciate that, and I'm grateful for the students of St. Paul's School of Theology and the ways they engage in serious theological deliberations. So here's a little back to seminary part. I just want to set a context for us in thinking about the Psalter. And I want to start by thinking about the development of reading. We take it for granted in many ways, those of us who are in educated circles, but it really is an amazing feat when you stop to think about it. We learn to speak without having to be really taught. we learn to speak kind of through osmosis, but reading takes a kind of discipline, and it wasn't always available. The time and the energy it took to learn to read wasn't widely available, really until the early modern era opened up greater accent on public schools. So the development of the printing press with Gutenberg and others helped us stabilize texts and make them more affordable. So there's kind of a nice coordination of people learning to read and people purchasing texts. The printing industry is a really fascinating development. Gutenberg actually went bankrupt. It's a piece of his story I didn't know until the last few years, but it cost so much for him to print the Bible, the first run of the Bible, and I guess his printing press shop was just full of sheaves of paper that his investor called in the loan and he couldn't pay it. And so he had to sell his printing presses. But I just want to think about the importance of reading and how, especially in certain Protestant circles, that becomes a really important part of our Christian study, that we are able to connect with the text by reading it independently. The second point there on academic disciplines, I want you to think a little bit of the great chasm that develops between Bible and theology in the modern period. It's interesting that even as we are heirs of a tradition on sola scriptura, or scripture alone, and the primacy of the Bible in Protestantism, we also see a divorce in some ways between theological studies and biblical studies. And part of that is because the development of biblical studies becomes so specialized. The numbers of languages that are reclaimed, you probably know that the Reformation happened around the time of the Renaissance, and a reclaiming of languages of Greek and Hebrew, not just working in Latin, but eventually we learn other languages, Aramaic and other Semitic languages, and these are all formative for biblical scholarship. Also, the deep study of history, geography, iconography, archaeology, all of these are developments in the modern era and shape the ways that biblical scholars approach the biblical text. As Shelley pointed out in my intro, I always see myself as kind of working on the cusp between biblical scholarship and constructive theology, with Luther studies kind of a dash in there too. And I just put up the first text I worked on is a reading of Eve and Adam's story in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And I edited that with two friends. Important work for us, and looking at the history of interpreting that story. And now some of the students, now alums, will recognize that I'm doing a lot of work on that Hagar and Sarah and their families, because I teach a course at the seminary called People of the Book, where we look at the importance of scripture in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in particular. All of that leads to telling a little bit about an invitation I received from Amy Plantinga-Powell and the late Bill Plaker to write for Westminster. John Knox launched a series called Belief, and their desire was to ask theologians to write biblical commentary that usually, and I've even had good friends who are biblical scholars say, though theologians have no truck with writing biblical commentary, that's the provenance of biblical scholars. But this is the project of Belief, and so maybe some of you know some of those volumes. Justo Gonzalez and many others have been writing. Sorry, I went too fast. Have been writing in that. Yeah, and I'm working with Don Saliers of Emory University on the Psalms, and it probably will be the last volume that's published in the series. It's taking us a long time, but we're finding our way. But opportunities like this, a chance to share my research and think and talk with others, helps me prepare for that. Before we get into talking about the Psalm study, I would ask if we could just take a moment for prayer, just to kind of focus ourselves. So if you would get in a comfortable position, I'm going to ask you to do let's do 3 centered breathings with me. So would you please breathe in God's life and breathe out God's love for the whole world. Breathe in God's life. Breathe out God's love for the whole world. Breathe in God's life. Breathe out God's love for the whole world. Amen. So let's just kind of chat a little bit about the Psalms themselves. They're written in what we term Hebrew poetry, and it has the features that I've listed there. The second item, the vocabulary is dense. It's simple, but it's also innovative. So you get a lot of interesting twists on familiar imagery that is part of what makes it so salient across eras of time. Another feature, point 3 there, that many of the Hebrew words are unknown to us. Some of them are used only once or twice in the whole of Scripture. So scholars debate and try to understand, what is this root and what does it mean in this context? Or maybe I should say root. But it's a fascinating thing that such an ancient text also has so much mystery and so much discovery, including the new discoveries that are coming to Psalm study because of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the late 40s. So that work is really just beginning to be harvested, and many of you will see new information across your lifetime, and that's true for generations to come. One of the significant features of Hebrew poetry is the use of parallel lines that sometimes reiterate the same point or amplify the same point, or sometimes even work at the point from the opposite position. And we'll see some of that as we get into particular Psalms later on. But just to remember that that's one of the important features that we've come to see about Psalm studies, and it really helps in thinking about Hebrew poetry. And another piece, I don't know when you took your Hebrew Bible class, but the development in the modern scholarship included grouping Psalms into kinds of collections, so-called genre criticism or even form criticism. And one of the things that they noticed on this point is that Psalms can sometimes be spoken by an individual, and sometimes they're spoken by a community, so that the voicing can be quite different. And then also there's difference in structure, and some structures have particular forms, and the Lament is one of those structures. So I want to talk about that today. But also there are other Psalms that don't have particular structures, but they resonate with each other because of the kind of theme they have or the content. And the so-called trust Psalms that I'm using as a comfort psalm are in that category. So we just kind of developing that point a little further, the form structure, but people often talk about that some Psalms are hymns, some are thanksgiving, some are laments. and over here on content and theme, the Wisdom Torah, the emphasis on being wise and not foolish, or obeying the law and not disobeying it. And then the Psalms of Zion, the kind of a treasury of Jerusalem, the Zion Psalms. Enthronement Psalms, sometimes they're called royal Psalms, and they may have been used in particular occasions of a king. After the destruction of the monarchy, they may be more thinking about God as king. And then also entrance Psalms, that might be the entrance into Jerusalem or the entrance into the temple itself. So here's our first point of conversation. I wanted to ask you some things about the Psalms and how they factor in your own professional and personal life. And it'd just be fun to hear from a few of you about where, in terms of your congregation, what kind of liturgical use. Here's kind of the Lutheran sensibility that where do you, some of you may use the Revised Common Lectionary, where there is a psalm assigned for each day, Sunday. It's common to use especially Psalm 23 at funerals, but a lot of our hymnody is also based in the Psalter. And some of you may have used Psalms for preaching. So liturgical use, or have you done biblical studies with the Psalms? And then thinking about matters of personal prayer and personal study.
I use Psalms in my personal prayers, and I enjoy rewriting them into what's going on in my own life. And I find that sometimes when free writing journaling doesn't work very well, then that's the time to look at a psalm and see how it's applying to my life.
Oh, that's a beautiful use to use the kind of the forms that we have, but put your own content to that for your own prayer life.
There's been, oh, go ahead, Ashley. There's a comment.
Just was going to say, yeah, there's been a comment from the chat of somebody who's in her first appointment saying that she's often used them liturgically, but never preached them, but also uses them personally as well. Right?
Yeah, they really are probably the rarest use of them is in preaching. And even the Revised Common Lectionary isn't assigning them as a preaching text. It's really more as a response text. So even if you follow the lectionary, you're not kind of encouraged to use them for preaching.
I've been involved since March in an interesting project where I do online content produced with a ELCA pastor and a Presbyterian pastor. And during ordinary time, we find that we've had to negotiate what psalm we're going to use liturgically because there's a different track. Methodists, we think of the lectionary psalms as being the ones that follow the semi-continuous Old Testament readings, and there are thematic New Testament readings throughout ordinary time. And that gives us a great deal of latitude. And so I've kind of thrown myself into those quasi-thematic psalms liturgically, and that's been a great comfort actually for me and I've done that in my own worship planning as well. And I've usually do use them as liturgically, although I have preached on the Psalms and especially the 23rd Psalm. Mm-hmm. And I think in my research on that, for that sermon, I mentioned that the popularity and the centrality of the 23rd Psalm is actually a 19th century American invention for a great part. Post-Civil War, it was the Lament Psalm or the Comfort Psalm that really came into fashion at that time.
Oh, that's fascinating, Dan. Yeah, that fits with, I think, so much of our customs and traditions around death and dying got reshaped because of the carnage of the Civil War and the great grief of the nation. So there's a lot of work has been done by American historians about grief and patterns of funeral rites following the Civil War, and that fits right in with that. Good, yeah.
One more question that has come in, and maybe now or through your presentation, if you could speak at some point to any wisdom you have for preaching on any of these texts through Lament or through the Nurturing of the Souls. If you have any wisdom that you could offer through this time to us, that may be coming, but we would welcome that.
Well, I don't know, let's see if what we can, maybe when we get to the end, if we can, we're going to look at 2 Psalms somewhat deeply and see if we see opportunities there. Or actually what the phrase in the biblical witness is usually that others are gnashing their teeth at you. I said that the Lament Psalms tend to have a shape or a form. And one of the things that scholars who work in this field, they might identify 3, 4, 5. A lot of these things are kind of approximations. Even the language of lament, some people would rather call them complaint psalms, and there's different language that gets used. So you kind of have to be a little fluid, but these are pretty much agreed upon, that there's usually some form of address, invocation, calling God out into attention, or asking God to wake up even. There's a description of the grievance. Sometimes that's the longest section of the lament. There's usually a statement of trust in God. Sometimes that includes recalling how God has acted with the forebearers. We remember that you brought the people across the Red Sea, kind of thing. So it's stating the trust, and then call for God to act now. And then often there'll be a closing promise by the lamenter, not necessarily a, if you do this, I'll do that, but some sense, I will praise you, I will trust in you, that kind of description. So with that in mind, I'm going to, if you can kind of keep those 5 points: invocation, grievance, trust in God, calling on God to act, and the promise. I wanted us to take a more sustained look at a particular lament psalm, Psalm 55. And I've asked Shelley and Ashley if they would take turns reading it. I'll just say at the beginning that this superscription, it's called, and we'll talk about, I guess I have a heavy finger today. The superscription is something we've learned from the Dead Sea Scrolls, how late they get added, and that they are added with a kind of variety, that there are scrolls in that finding that have no superscription in them. Trying to make out what they mean, and when they were added, worthy of many dissertations. In Protestantism and Protestant, and I believe this is true of Catholic Bibles, we don't count that. We start our versification here. But in Jewish Bibles, they will tend to start the versification here. So if you're working with a rabbi, preparing a sermon series or something, or a prayer service, you'll have different verses to your Psalms. But with that, let me ask Shelley if you would start with Psalm verse 1, and then Ashley pick up with verse 2, and you can see it splits right here at verse 3. And so if you just alternate between you, we'll get a chance to hear the psalm, as well as read it with our eyes, and kind of pay attention for these matters of invocation, description, request, and trust. Oh, sorry, we're gonna have trouble here. Okay, one more. There, thank you.
Give ear to my prayer, O God. Do not hide yourself from my supplication.
Attend to me and answer me. I am troubled in my complaint. I am distraught.
By the noise of the enemy, because of the clamor of the wicked, for they bring trouble upon me, and in anger they cherish enmity against me.
That's a hard one.
My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me.
Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror overwhelms me.
And I say, oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest.
Truly, I would flee far away. I would lodge in the wilderness.
I would hurry to find shelter for myself from the raging wind and tempest.
Confuse, O Lord, confound their speech, for I see violence and strife in the city.
Day and night they go around it on its walls, and iniquity and trouble are within it.
Ruin is in its midst, oppression and fraud. Do not depart from its marketplace.
It is not enemies who taunt me. I could bear that. It is not adversaries who deal insolently with me. I could hide from them.
But it is you, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend.
With whom I kept pleasant company. We walked in the house of God with the throng.
Let death come upon them. Let them go down alive into Sheol, for evil is in their homes and in their hearts.
But I call upon God, and the Lord will save me.
Evening and morning and at noon, I utter my complaint and moan, and he will hear my voice.
He will redeem me unharmed from the battle that I wage, for many are arrayed against me.
God, who is enthroned from of old, will hear and will humble them, because they do not change and do not fear God.
My companion laid hands on a friend and violated a covenant with me.
With speech smoother than butter, but with a heart set on war, with words that were softer than oil, but in fact were drawn swords.
Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved.
But you, O God, will cast them down into the lowest pit. The bloodthirsty and treacherous shall not live out half their days, but I will trust in you.
Amen. If you've got a different translation, we would also be interested in kind of comments there. But I wanted to see, I've got some questions here, and I go to next for a conversation about the Lament. And you may have others. These are three I pulled for us. I said that this psalm offers many descriptions of the enemy. What do you gather from the images that are used? How might these images apply and not apply to enemies known to you and your communities? And the second question I formed is verse 16 and 17 say that the psalmist calls upon God by complaint and moan, evening, morning, and at noon. How do you assess such a practice? 3, what does the psalmist ask God to do? How do you assess such requests? I could say one reason of the Lament Psalms, maybe one thing I can say while you're thinking is, one reason I chose this particular psalm today is that I was thinking about the incredible divisions that are upon us in our communities. And it seems that these senses of betrayal by intimates, that the enemy isn't only somebody far away, but the enemy is somebody who has been, as the psalmist says, my companion, my friend, that sense of betrayal and conflict is something I've sure heard people express, that they either are no longer friends, or they cannot speak with their family members, in that sense. So the psalm gives voice to that very real situation that so many of us are feeling.
Well, and I would add, it says in verse 2, it says, I'm distraught by the noise of the enemy, by the clamor of the wicked. And I just hear noise often in the world around. And it's not even like it's just the distraction of the lack of ability to kind of listen deeply and that sort of thing. So it's not even necessarily words that are violent there, but just the noise of it becomes violent, actually.
Yeah. That's a great point. It definitely would be a place where you could pause and think about matters of the noise that so many people are just exhausted by. Thanks, Ashley. Yeah. Other observations?
Jim.
Yeah, one of the things that I think about when I read the Psalms is it's easy to read them and say, how does this relate to my enemies or those I see as my enemies? I found I'm spending much more time looking at those descriptions and saying, if I'm somebody else's enemy, and I am in this world, I mean, we live in a really divisive world, then how does that apply to me? If I sit on the other side of that, what does it mean for me to be an enemy, and what does that mean in terms of God's call and claim on my life and what I'm supposed to do? Because if I look at it in terms of what it says about my enemy, then it just increases the division and lets me sit and put myself over against someone else, as opposed to saying, what's it say about me? Not about them. What's it say about me? So it's kind of changed my reading of the Psalms in some ways.
That's a beautiful point, Jim. Was there something in particular that sparked that reading for you?
No, I think part of it is that I try to do, I use the Episcopal Daily Office, and so I'm usually reading 4 or 5 Psalms a morning. Plus, we do one every Sunday in church. One of the readings is a psalm, and I try to make some reference in terms of working it into the preaching. So as I've spent more and more time with them, I've really come to the point of saying I've either got to look at it in terms of I'm angry at everybody who doesn't like me, and I'm going to cry out to God about that, or I'm going to say, what does it mean for other people what does it mean for other people to see me as my enemy? And that's the one way I can live with the Psalms, because otherwise it's really difficult for me to deal with the anger and the lament and the division that seems to be in a lot of them.
Yeah, that is troubling to many people. And so I think that is a very creative approach to it. I'm at the end of my presentation, I got a little brief bibliography, and I've got on there an article where a biblical scholar has looked at this particular psalm in relationship to issues of domestic and intimate partner violence. And she is encouraging us to kind of think of a different superscription, and to think of it where somebody who is now saying to their intimate companion, you're betraying me, you're harming me. So that a different kind of reading is possible there too. But that's to come in terms of the bibliography for some of you who are working in that area or want to follow through with it. It's another way to think about issues of the use of this particular psalm. Most of the lament psalms end up with some kind of positive assertion. There is one, I think it's Psalm 88, where it just ends. It doesn't say, God, I know you'll pull me out of this. I trust in you. It just describes woe upon woe. So there is even a place for that in our Psalter. But I want to turn to the nurturing part of our time this morning and think of Psalms of comfort. And this one, I was telling Shelley, this is a little gem that I've become so excited about, is maybe one word, comforted by. I'm so grateful that my Psalm study has brought me into familiarity with Psalm 131. You can see it's only 3 verses long. O Lord, my heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. But I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. My soul is like the weaned child that is with me. Or the alternate reading, or my soul within me is like a weaned child. And I've got a slide to compare those. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time on and forevermore. So the Song of Ascents, let's just pause there for a minute. This is the NRSV's title, a way of rendering the superscription. In this Common English Bible, the CEB, it's called a pilgrimage song. And in both ways, the point is that there's this kind of sense of going up or being on a pilgrimage, and there's a collection of psalms in the Psalter from Psalm 120 to 134 that are known as the Song of Ascents. And scholars debate, what does this going up, being on pilgrimage mean? It could mean that people are going to Jerusalem for a festival, or it could mean that people are going up the steps of the temple, and could have a couple different meanings, but some sense of probably small songs that people sang. And they're very short usually. I love this one, 3 verses. That's quite different than our work with their complaint psalm earlier. So often 3 to 5 verses. There's one that's 8 verses. But the sense is that they're probably, because they're short, they could be memorized and people could sing them. So that's one thing I want you to know about this. I've also been very interested, several scholars have pointed out that they think this particular verse, if not the whole psalm, could have been written by a woman. It's one of the very few texts that I've seen kind of standard traditional scholars claiming, Patrick Miller being one, that this verse shows that the experience of a woman who has had a child and weaned that child successfully. So that speaking from that experience, that I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. My soul is like the weaned child that is with me. So the tremendous sense of comfort and calm that has come about by kind of being weaned, but being able to be reunited with the mother who at one time was a nursing mother. We have a couple things going on here that are pretty incredible. Okay, we did that. Now, can you see, I put them side by side, the difference between what the NRSV has and its alternate. Both of them have this like a weaned child with its mother. My soul is like the weaned child that is with me, or my soul within me is like a weaned child. But either way, there's a great attentiveness to what it means to now return to find comfort in the and be able to be held without the anxiety. Those of us who have nursed and weaned, you know how there's a long period where when the child comes to your lap, it's uncomfortable for you and the child because it wants to nurse and you don't want it to nurse anymore. And there's that kind of awkward negotiation of space but here this has happened now successfully. The weaning has been accomplished, and this is the psalmist's depiction of this is what my soul is like. My soul is like a weaned child. And some people then say there's similarly, not only is this maybe authored by a woman, but there is an image of God as a mother who has weaned at work in this psalm. That the soul is now comfortable with God like a child who has been weaned. So that's one text I wanted to really bring to you today. Short as it is, it's just beautifully pithy. And I put a couple of questions for us. How does it shape your experience of this text to imagine it being sung by a woman as she walked to a festival? 2, what do you make of its imagery of God as a mother who has weaned her child so successfully? And 3, what do you make of its image of the singer of this psalm as being calm in the lap of such a mother? And this is where biblical scholars can point us in certain directions, but we as theologians can then develop in our theologizing and our own practice of prayer and leading congregational study. We can think more deeply about what this gem might mean for us.
I think it's interesting to think about being that weaned child and what that feels like, that not weaned child and how that feels. And it is anxious, as you described, and you're hungry and you're seeking and you're needing, it's very self-centered, I guess, is the word that I would look for. And so that flip of being nestled in the lap of a mother and just being content in their presence and their relationship and not having that self-seeking focus, but just being together, I think is just really extraordinary.
Oh, that's really well said, Anne. And really, yeah, I mean, it does and I think you're right, it captures both moments, doesn't it? That you're on the other side of something that was filled with a kind of uncomfortable, and many of us may find ourselves there right now, in our relationships with God. But to have this other image too, that your work in this group on liminality and crossing thresholds, weaning is certainly a successful weaning, is really moving to the other side of that threshold, and the kind of comfort and a restoration of intimacy without the actual nursing. It's a beautiful way to imagine, I think, our way of being with God. Others.
Hi. I thought of two things while I was listening to both the psalm as you read it, as well as the conversation questions. And first of all, I thought this would make something great to preach on if I wanted to focus specifically on a Mother's Day sermon. But also I think for all of creation as well, if there's something I wanted to preach on concerning creation, this would be another great psalm to focus on for that, to bring in.
Julie, can you say a little bit more about the latter? When you say what is it that you see that brings it into all creation?
Because mothers are creators. I mean, I know fathers are a part of that, but mothers are the ones that carry the child, that nurse the child, that wean the child. And that's what God did with us in creation. He created us in all of creation in steps, and then us as humans in his image. And so I can see how, especially like this question of the imagery of God as a mother who has weaned her child successfully. And I believe God did wean us successfully. We rebelled after we were weaned, but I believe God did wean us successfully, and continue to be with us, continue to walk with us, continue to want us to come back to his lap and sit on his lap, and we instead rebelled against him. So I think you could easily take that and make it a sermon. But I also had a personal image that jumped into my mind. I had a great grandmother that I was pretty young, about 4 years old when she passed, but I still remember her because, you know, she never nursed us. She would always want us to crawl into her lap, and she would rock us and talk to us and sing to us and tell us stories. And I kept thinking of her while you were reading this, and it just was so warming to my heart. And to have those images come into my mind as you read it. So those were the two things that caught me about this particular
No, that's good. That's really good, Julie. Thanks for developing your point too. I appreciate that, because I know I understand better, and I think you've got some great imagery going there that would be worthy of exploration, and I think make connection for many of us. You know, not everybody, but many people have that sense of the comfort of somebody's lap, and what that feels like. And so how does that shape our sense of being in God's presence? It's a very different image than kind of the formal temple, sense of liturgical propriety and things like that, I think. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I'm watching our time, and I think I've got 1 minute left. Is that right?
Yeah.
So let me quickly, I want to get Martin Luther in here before we go away, and then I'll show you the bibliography. But this is, Luther also loved to use short words and pithy kinds of imagery. And he talked about the Psalter being like a little Bible. And so here's a part of the text. It seems to me that the Holy Spirit wanted to take the trouble to compile a short Bible, an example book of all saints, so that whoever could not read the whole Bible would have here almost an entire summary of it comprised in one little booklet. And if you see the context of that, he's talking about how we are invited to bring our whole lives before God, and we don't have to hide any feeling that the God invites us. And so that's the kind of dimension, the little Bible.
Well, we are so grateful for your presence here with us today, Dr. Kvam, and I know that you did get us back into the seminary student mode, or the learner mode, and so we do just thank you so much for that. As we kind of wrap up our time together today, I want to see if you have a final word of encouragement or hope that you would offer to us as we're listening to you today.
I guess my word of encouragement is the Psalms encourage us to bring our whole lives, our whole self, as individuals and even as communities, to bring them to God. And sometimes that's really hard for Protestants to do in the United States, where we think only certain parts should be revealed. And I think the invitation is just so overwhelming.
Thank you. That's beautiful. I have to make the point that the Lutheran brought us Martin Luther today, and so we are grateful for that reminder of our heritage, and so thank you for that as well. Well, friends, we do have one more Theology 101 conversation, and so next week we're going to be offering an opportunity to kind of make explicit our conversation of our context as Christians, the church. And so we will be having a focus on ecclesiology, and we'll be talking about how we can understand and live into being the church when we are not able to gather in one place for worship as we are used to doing. So Dr. Amy Oden and the Reverend Austin Rivera will be joining us for that conversation. So anyone who wants to join next Thursday, September 24th at 10:30 a.m., you can register for that conversation and find more resources at greatplainsumc.org/@-the-threshold.